Hello to everyone joining us today, and welcome to the London School of English Live. Every week you can join these interactive sessions, improve your English, and connect directly to our expert English trainers. Today's topic is very close to our heart. It's British Business English. And so this is for all of you in our English learning community who work with British colleagues and business partners. We designed this event to make your communication easier, better, and more effective. So we have just a couple of technical issues with the sound, but it should be fixed now. So just to continue, as many of you know, Business and Professional English is part of our course program, and we have been delivering courses in virtual groups during lockdown. And from 31st of August, when our London Centre in Holland Park reopens, we will also be offering face-to-face classes in Business and Professional English to motivated clients aged 25 and over. We also have more specialized courses in legal English, English for human resources, and for specific business needs, both for individuals and for companies. So do check our website, www.londonschool.com, to learn how we can help you to be confident in your business English. Today, I'm thrilled to be introducing two of my colleagues, our expert business English trainer, John Dyson, and our Director of Sales and Marketing, Joe Burns. John Dyson has been teaching professional English to international clients here in London for many, many years. He also lived and worked in Spain for 20 years. He wrote a book, Working Virtually, which is specifically designed for English language learners and teaches you how to function more effectively in conference calls and write better emails. And he's also a winner of Business English Teaching Awards, which is a fantastic achievement. Jo Burns have been working with international colleagues and partners across the globe. She speaks many languages and really understands the difficulties that you might have with a second language. Both John and Joe have a great deal of advice for you in terms of working with your British colleagues. So do stay with us. And at the end, we would be answering your questions. So don't hesitate to write them as well as your comments in the live chat next to the video throughout the session. So, so good to have you here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Olga, and hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream from the London School of English. My name is John Dyson. I'm one of the trainers here at the London School of English. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming today, for joining us. These are strange times, but through the wonders of technology, we still have a good time and communicate with each other in English. Even so, I'm sure we all hope to be back in the classroom, as Olga mentioned, in the coming weeks, because that's where learners and teachers truly belong. So I am delighted to be giving this talk today, as it's something very close to my heart. Firstly, as an Englishman, but also as a business English trainer with an interest in cross-cultural communication. But before I begin, I'd like to welcome Joe to this event. Joe, you have a lot of international business meetings here in London, and you travel all over the world to meet clients, don't you?
Yes, that's true. Yes, thanks, John. Hi, Miriam. How you doing? Yeah, well, we're focusing in this live stream on the language we can use in these business meeting situations. And we're also going to be talking about how to chat politely, how to make small talk, easy topics for you to discuss with people. And I'm sure you'll all find that very useful as well. So I'll let you crack on with the lesson.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And hello, Miriam from Turkey. It's good to see your name on our chat chart. I remember working with you for several weeks back in those distant days of February and early March. Anyway, as I said earlier, I'm very excited about this talk because I know for a fact that it will help you to improve your English use and understanding. For learners of English, general and business focused, communicating with British native speaker colleagues can be a challenge. So today we're going to look at various ways that you can help yourself to communicate better when working with British colleagues or clients. So that means how to create a positive impression and to make your communication more effective. Britain is proud that English is the international language for business, travel, science, politics. And that's good. We should be proud of that. However, it also means that Brits like to show how well they use their language. And they don't always make a lot of allowances for people who do not have English as their first language. That means that you need certain strategies for managing those situations. So the first area, we're going to look at several areas, but the first area we'll look at is how British people often communicate a message. Basically, you may need to read between the lines. That means that the message you hear in their words may not necessarily be the message they are truly sending. The British are inventors of world diplomacy, and they use our wonderful language to perfection in that respect. But that sometimes means the message is not so clear, especially for the non-native speaker or listener. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's take this exchange. You're in the office with your boss and you say to your boss, I sent you my report earlier. Was it what you wanted? And your boss replies, yes, on the whole, it seemed to cover most of the areas we need to look at. That answer may sound positive, but it's not entirely direct, is it? It's not transparent. Is it a yes? Is it a no? It could mean that the Brits are happy with your report, that it's acceptable, or it could mean it's not really satisfactory and the person is being polite and they expect you to interpret that as the real meaning of the message. So the question is, what can you do? The best thing is to have a strategy for clarifying what he or she really means. And the best way of doing that, there are many ways, but one of the best ways is simply ask for a definite answer. So you could say, so is it okay, or does it need more work? Or you could say, what areas need more work? Or what areas are missing? All of these expressions are polite and they all put some pressure, light pressure, on the other person, the Brit, to be a bit clearer about the real message. It asks them to come down on one side or the other. Either it's okay or it's not okay. And that's the message you need. So this area of clarification is an important and useful tool when working with British English speakers. In fact, it's important for quite a lot of contexts in business. You may need the language of clarification in a meeting, on a one-to-one exchange, on the phone, whenever. You may even need it to respond to an email if the language is rather too indirect. Let's just take a few more examples. If you don't understand what someone says, you can prompt them to say it again more clearly by saying, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Because catch doesn't actually always mean I didn't understand it. It could mean I didn't hear it. So could you speak just a little more clearly, please? Or there are a number of other expressions that you could use. You know, for example, what exactly do you mean when you say blah, 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 blah? Or how do you mean? I don't follow you. Or paraphrasing or reformulating what they said. So if I understand you correctly, you mean... So all of those are expressions that you could use. It's not my intention to give you a long list of set expressions that you need to memorize. I think it's simply a question of thinking about what you want to say, what message do you want to give? And the message is, please clarify. So the point is, be prepared to need to ask for clarification, because we British don't always speak very clearly. And the danger is that if you don't ask for clarity, they will assume you understand everything, and maybe they won't change the way they are communicating with you. They may start speaking more quickly, or assume that you simply understand fast-spoken or rather unclear native English. Okay, that's one point. The next point, another important area that helps you to communicate better is to check that the other person understands what you are saying. British people generally don't ask people for clarification. So if you get a feeling that the Brit doesn't really understand your point, you can ask them. You can say things like, do you see what I mean? Or do you see my point? My main message here is don't be afraid to check and clarify where necessary, because it can save you a lot of time. And in fact, I always say to my learners, if you express an opinion in a very elegant way, in a meeting with a group of native speakers, for example, you need perhaps to use these expressions to like, do you see what I mean? Or do you see my point? Or what do you think about that? What's your opinion? Because otherwise the danger is they won't give you any opinion or feedback. They'll simply go straight on to their own point. Okay, I'm going to move on to another big area for me, which is something that can be quite intimidating if you're not used to doing it. Interrupting. You may find yourself in a situation where the British speaker is going on and on and on, and you can't say anything because you cannot get a word in edgeways. To get a word in edgeways basically means there's no way or opportunity to speak because the other person won't stop speaking. And you know what you need to do is find a way of stopping them. So what can you do? There is a very simple way of getting someone to stop speaking if they're in mid-flow and you really want to say something, even when you're on a conference call. All you do is just say their name loudly and clearly. Excuse me, John. They will stop. They will stop speaking just like that. Then you can use expressions like the following. I'm sorry to interrupt, John. Can I interrupt? I have a quick question. May I say something? Could I make a point? So all of those expressions and many more, but let's not overdo it here, are useful in terms of being able to interrupt the person in a way that is not seen as aggressive or impolite. Because it is a little aggressive simply to start speaking over the top of them. It is interpreted as aggressive by English speakers sometimes. It's interpreted as rather rude. And I should emphasize that I don't make value judgments about different ways of communicating depending on cultural background. I lived in Spain for 20 years and I had to adapt to a certain and quite different way of communicating out there to what I was used to in England. I'll refer to this again a couple of occasions later on. So British people do interrupt each other, don't get me wrong, but unless you know the person very well, it is seen as rather impolite to interrupt without using a phrase like the ones we've just seen. I think British colleagues will appreciate the fact that you know how to do that and you can do it politely. And I think when you're able to do it, it does wonders for your self-confidence. If you're able to interrupt successfully to make your point or to ask a question, the alternative is that you are condemned to silence. Okay, the next area of language I want to talk about returns to the theme of direct or indirect language. This is a cross-cultural issue as much as a language point. There are certain national or regional cultures where speaking directly is seen as a good thing. Your message is clear, it's transparent, it's not open to misunderstanding or misinterpretation. But there are other cultures where it is seen as being rather aggressive or even rude or embarrassing when somebody speaks so directly. It can be seen as rather threatening. When communicating with British colleagues, I believe that they will like you more if you can use their language to communicate in a similar way to what they do, in a less direct way than you may be accustomed to. And I've used a phrase here, you could call this gift wrapping your language. You know, when you give a present to someone, well, you know, you can either say, okay, here's your present. It's a bag. Oh, very nice. Yes, it looks very nice. If you wrap it with a bit of wrapping paper and a bit of ribbon, it looks nicer when you present it to them. So linguistically, let me give you an example of what I mean. Several examples. I'll show you how you can build up the language to make it sound more appropriate for the specific situation. Let's say that your basic message is this: give me an answer. Very clear, right? But also quite aggressive. So how about I want an answer? Slightly less direct, but still quite direct and forceful. Let's try another way. Can you give me an answer? Okay, I would say by formulating a question like that, then we're moving in the right direction if we're trying to be a little more polite. What about John? Can you give me an answer, please? Aha, the magic word. As you can see, that sentence is the same as the previous sentence, but with two words added: the person's name and the word please. And I'm sure, as you know, the British love please and they love thank you. And to be honest, it does make a difference to your communication style, because it means you are adapting to a more British style of communicating. You are adapting to, let's say, the norms of how people make requests of each other, or ask for a favor, or simply ask somebody to do something for them. You know, using a name, I've always said this in many of my classes, people get to know each other quite well during our courses, and they know each other's names. But in a meeting, they seem to forget to use other people's names. And I think using a name in itself is quite a softener, in a sense, in that it creates a rather more positive and dynamic than simply saying, what do you think? Okay, there are other expressions, going back to that, what I want you to do something. There are other expressions, such as, if the request is really important to you, let's take this as an example. Would you mind giving me an answer when you can? That sounds a lot more elegant, let's say. And I think the force of the message is likely to get a more positive response than give me an answer. After that, we can sound extremely polite. And I would give you two more examples, both of which are not generally used in everyday situations. But if you are sending an email to someone where you need them to do you a big favor, these are good expressions to use, rather than simply saying, can you do this? So the first one is, I would be very grateful if you could give me an answer. I would be very grateful if you could, plus whatever ending you like. And the second one is, I would really appreciate it if you could give me an answer soon. I would really appreciate it. Of course, as you can see on the screen, the more polite, the more formal. And the more formal, the more words you have to use. And the more words you have to use, the more complex the language. But I would say that in these cases, it is a positive thing to use more words, because it adds more value to your message, and it sounds more like what a native speaker might say or write in a business context, whether it's spoken or written. In fact, if we look briefly, we'll look very briefly at written communication, emails, and we can see that a message can be received and interpreted very differently depending on the way we use language. So in a moment, we're going to put up email one. And email one, it's very short, very efficient, and very direct. But to be perfectly honest, if I received an email like this, I wouldn't be too happy. And I have received emails like this, to be perfectly honest. And in my mind, it makes me think, well, why should I do this person a big favor in a big hurry when they can't even have the courtesy to put my name at the beginning. So they've got no name at the beginning. We've got spelling mistakes there. We've got another spelling mistake. Needs is not a word. It doesn't exist. It should be needs. And the assumption is that I understand the expression a heads up. In fact, my English isn't particularly fantastic, and I've never heard that expression before. I'm not really sure what it means. There's a capitalized word here, which isn't really correct. And there's no ending. There's no thank you. There's no name. It gives the impression of a piece of communication done in a bit of a hurry and without much care and attention, which might tempt you to treat it in the same way, which is not really, I imagine, what the sender wants. If I wanted to write an email and express a certain amount of politeness in the content, I would probably write, and this is exactly the same reason for writing the email, it's the same request. I'd probably write something like this email. Now in this one, as you can see, I've said hello and I've used your name. I've said I hope all's well with you, which takes literally 2 seconds to write, because sometimes people say to me, oh, I haven't got time to write things like that, and I'm not really interested anyway. It's not the point. The point is, it doesn't cost you anything to write hope all's well with you. You don't have to say any more. Just a quick request. So you are specifying why you are writing. Could you send me the project status report when you have a minute? Now you may say, well, no, not when they have a minute. I want it right now. The British person will interpret when you have a minute as meaning they would like this fairly soon. So, and I'll just, oh yes, it says the sooner the better, to be honest. Okay, in that case, that's fine because they've asked politely and because the managing director needs the information. At the end, you can just say thanks, or you can use this nice little elegant expression, much appreciated. Much appreciated is a way of saying thank you very much indeed. 2 words, half a second to write that. Well, a second if you're a slow writer. My point being, it doesn't take much to create a positive expression in written English, especially, even with business emails, even when you don't have an awful lot of time. So that's my little piece of information about emails. I'm going to move on and talk about one more important way that British speakers, where they often use short expressions, which is at the beginning of messages or something that you say, which the other person might consider as being rather negative or unwelcome. We call these short introductory phrases softeners, and we use softeners quite a lot. When I say softener, what I mean is it's the same as the liquid you put in your washing machine to make your jumpers and your clothes soft and smell really nice. So it's a linguistic softener. It softens the message a little bit. So for example, you may want to say, that's a bad idea, or I don't agree. And again, I go back and say, okay, your message is very clear, but it's quite aggressive. And if you say it in the wrong tone, you don't smile, then it could be interpreted as being slightly over forceful. It's very clear, but it's very direct. So I'm going back. I might be repeating this point, but it is a very important point. Actually, not just with British speakers of English, but I think with many nationalities and cultures who you do business with around the world. So what about trying these alternatives? So rather than saying, I don't agree, you could say, I'm sorry, but that isn't a good idea. So what I've done there is I've used the phrase, I'm sorry, but, and I've added to it, that isn't, so I've turned the is into isn't, negative, of a good idea. So I've turned the negative adjective into a positive adjective. So it isn't quite so direct. And again, we're not talking about tremendously complicated ideas or pieces of language. Another thing you could say, I'm not sure if I agree with you. Then the other person is going to say, oh, if they say I'm not sure, if I agree with you, they probably disagree more than they agree. Okay, but that doesn't sound quite so deterministic as I don't agree with you. So the message is essentially the same, but you've gift wrapped it, so it doesn't sound so aggressive or dismissive. And we appreciate that as British people. Other phrases that we can use at the beginning of a sentence when we want to express an opposing opinion are the following. So we've got expressions before we want to give bad news. So we can say, to be honest, to be frank, quite frankly, quite honestly. Sorry, John, but I see your point, but I understand your view, but. So all of these, you try them out in your next meeting, a Zoom call most likely, but hey, we will go back to meetings in the future. We cannot do without face-to-face communication. We can't. We'll do our best in the meantime, but not exactly the same. Anyway, my next section is about small talk. Small talk is what you do at the beginning of a meeting or conference call before all the participants have arrived and there is some dead time to fill. Small talk is good to break the ice so that there isn't that uncomfortable silence where everybody doesn't look at their camera and pretends that they're doing something else, because that happens in many conference calls, even among native speakers. So very often foreigners have a hard time knowing how to manage this unstructured situation. I've heard many course participants come to me and say, oh, I feel okay with negotiations or meetings or even conference calls most of the time, but socializing, oh, that's always a tricky one. So I think you can simply be reactive and wait until somebody includes you directly in the conversation. But that's fine, but it's not necessarily going to happen, which means that, you're condemned to sitting there in silence. So maybe it's a good idea to have a couple of questions prepared yourself. We Brits like a bit of small talk, nothing too controversial, no. The weather's always a good topic, as I'm sure you all know. So remember that you do have the language. It's not a difficult question to ask. How's the weather in London today? Or is it a nice day in London? Or what's the weather like where you are? In Tokyo, Singapore, wherever. I mean, to be honest, we are not tremendously interested in the weather in London. We're not meteorologists. But the point is, it establishes a positive atmosphere. It shows that you know how to socialize a little in the language. It shows that you're interested in the other person's situation, or the other people's situation. And I think that's tremendously important. Showing interest and trying to be proactive. And as I say, it's not complicated language to use. So perhaps you could make a list of 4 or 5 questions to ask in order to generate a little conversation, to fill that gap before the meeting starts. For good or for bad, this coronavirus situation is already subject of conversation around the world, unfortunately. So here are a few examples that you might start a conversation about that. You could say, what's the coronavirus situation in London? Are people going back to work? Is the situation getting better? Is it busy or quiet where you are, your part of London? So just think a little bit about, the kinds of questions you might ask in your own language. So there's no need to overcomplicate things and start asking people about what their hobbies are or what they did at the weekend. They may not want to tell you. Something nice and uncontroversial and fairly impersonal. And the weather or what life is like in the other person's city is a good one. Okay, my final message, I think I've got just enough time to do this, is about British humour, because I'm sure you all know how famous British humour is. So we British business people tend to use more humor than people from other cultures, I would say, in terms of business. And humor can be quite an exclusive thing when you don't speak the language like a native and you don't understand the language like a native. Humor can rely on very culturally specific references. And my experience living in Spain is that when I try to be humorous, I use the British Code of Humor. And the British Code of Humor is well known for being ironic. We like to use irony. And I found that in Spain, irony, which is essentially using a statement which is the opposite of what the reality is in order to get a humorous effect and get people to laugh, it doesn't really work in Spain. So I would translate my dry, ironic English humor into Spanish and get blank looks because people just didn't get it. And I can understand why they didn't. At the time, I didn't understand why. I thought, what, have they got no sense of humor? No, they have a different sense of humor. So we often say which is something which is opposite of what reality is, and that is understood by the British to be humorous. But that isn't necessarily the case for a lot of foreign business speakers of English. An extremely dry example of ironic British humor would be if a British person comments on, oh, how lovely the weather is, isn't it a beautiful day, when it is, in fact, pouring with rain. So my advice is, now, this is quite tricky because I can't give you concrete advice, but the first thing would be, if in doubt, especially on conference calls, just smile when somebody makes a humorous comment and everyone else smiles or laughs. You may not understand fully what was funny, but at least you won't look out of place. So a little smile on your lips. Don't look puzzled or worried. Just assume that whatever it was meant to relax people and it's not a threat to you. Just give them a little smile. The second thing I would recommend that you could do, because it's out there and it's a resource, is to listen to some humorous podcasts from the BBC. Now, the BBC has a dedicated section in its sounds section, which is on the website or available as an app, dedicated section for comedy. And try listening to some of that stuff. You know, not a great long programs, but maybe, you know, little parts, 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, because it gives you some kind of insight into how British humor works. And maybe when you hear some humor at your next conference call or the one after that, you may laugh because you may genuinely understand it. Okay. Well, that's been just over half an hour. That brings me to the end of my talk about how to communicate better when working with British colleagues and customers. Of course, it's an enormous subject and we could talk about it all evening, but we won't. However, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and I'll hand back to Olga.
Thank you, John. This was so interesting to hear your tips and advice, both linguistic and cultural, on how to work with British colleagues and partners. And I also want to say hello and thank you for joining us to both new people in our English learning community and also people that join us almost every live stream. So, for example, hello to Miriam and Frank Kuntz have been with us for pretty much every live stream, and Ali Abdi and new Jose Martin Lopez Jr. KI, it's been great to see all of your comments, and Nadia as well. And of course, Tanya guessed us from Brazil. So it's really great that you joined us. And we had also quite a few comments, for example, from Nadia and I think Tanya and a few other viewers who said that, for example, some of the things that are important in business English are also important in their languages as well, such as spelling. So that seems to be kind of one of the key elements in effective business communication. And also we saw some of the comments from Tanya on direct and indirect communication. So yes, and Tanya is just hello from Brazil. Yeah, so fantastic to see you here, Tanya. So the question, I guess, to the topic related to direct and indirect communication. For example, Tanya mentioned that it very much depends on the context, and then Brazil can find itself. Almost Brazilians can find themselves in the middle. So sometimes direct, sometimes indirect, and I guess. Joe, you would probably have quite a lot to add in that regard. So, but maybe just generally, I would kind of start with general question, which is when it comes to some tips on intercultural communication, because we have clients who join us for courses from so many different countries and cultures in the world, what would be apart from kind of the language aspect? What would be Joe and John your tips on intercultural things to know when it comes to communicating with British colleagues and partners? For example, how about what about punctuality? What about topics to talk about during networking? How would you greet people? What would be your advice here?
I think it is important to know your audience. So, for example, physical contact and punctuality, those non-verbal things, I think are very important to set the tone. Before you even say anything and show us all your lovely business English, the very first things are about, were you there when people expected you to be there, and how important is it? So in some cultures, it's very important to be there. Being on time is actually being 15 minutes early in Japan. Being on time for a meeting in England, we would expect you, I would say, 5 minutes beforehand, so the meeting begins on time. Obviously, in some other cultures, such as in Africa, for instance, you might be a day late. In Spain, maybe 20 minutes. You know, it varies. But the British quite like punctuality and would like meetings to just start on time. That's one of your points. And the other, I think about that non-verbal communication and how much small talk people expect. I would say, I was quite surprised when I went to a conference in Brazil and had a big series of meetings, one after the other, which was the plan, 20 meetings with a colleague who was Brazilian. And every 2 people that came to every appointment kissed everybody twice when they arrived and kissed everybody twice when they left. But I was surprised nobody had met each other before. For me, that was a bit too much, you know. And so for a British person, you would probably shake hands at the moment because we're social distancing. We'll just say hello and we'll show that we're willing to shake hands. And I think also in terms of that little bit of small talk, I know with German and Russian partners I've worked with, I might do a little bit about the weather because I'm British, but I can see them thinking, get on with the meeting. Whereas I know that somebody in Spain or in Italy wants to talk, especially for the first time, they're going to want to talk to me about, you know, and how is your family, or do you live near here? Do you have children? Because they want to know, actually, do they like you enough to even want to do any business with you? So they want to establish a relationship. For the Germans, for the Swedish, get to the point. I know I like your product. Let's do business. For the British, let's make each other comfortable, but then let's be efficient. And then for maybe more Latin cultures or for, you know, other cultures, that might be a lot longer than English people are comfortable with talking about personal things and getting to know each other. So just understand who's in the room and what they expect before you actually start using your business English. That would be my advice. John, what do you think?
Yeah, Joe, I agree with everything you've said there. I think I would add, and it's an interesting point that Tanya raised about context, is that, yeah, I think it, you know, it does depend on three things really for me. One is perhaps the cultural background from the country or region, and I would say region is as important as country, and knowing that because I was living in Catalonia and they never forgot to tell me this is Catalonia, it's not Spain. So I learned that fairly early on. The second thing is, not every person from a certain country is the stereotype of that sort of culture, and I think sometimes we need to bear this in mind. It sometimes is quite tempting to sort of say, well, all Germans are like that, and obviously that's not the case. And the third point I would say, well, is it a meeting? Is it a drink in the bar after the meeting? What is the purpose of the communication? What is the aim, and what is the right register that I should be using in this context? And yeah, shaking hands, or I was going to say bumping elbows, but maybe that's more American than British. I don't know. What do you think?
I think we started with that, but now it's just everybody's just used to.
Right. Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. And we've got Frank who's saying that he also agrees with quite a few things raised.
And then it's very, very multicultural, isn't it? In Luxembourg, you have lots of Germans and French and English and all sorts. Yeah. Very, very interesting business community there.
Definitely. And I'm just aware of the time. So unfortunately, we can talk so much about this topic, and we only have 45 minutes of the live stream. So of course, this is definitely a conversation to be continued. And one way to improve your business English, and particularly with a focus on intercultural communication, is taking our courses. So John and Joe, what would you say to those people who are considering taking our training to improve their business English? So what can they expect in terms of, for example, improving the British English if they wish to do so, and also improving their understanding of intercultural aspects? What is it like, our training, and what choice of training is on offer?
Okay, from a teacher's perspective in the classroom, I like to make my classes very interactive. I like to make them very practical and skills-based. So it's a mixture of working on language and making sure it's as correct as possible and pronunciation, but also looking at skills like participating in and leading meetings, for example. And I think the dimension that classes at the London School of English, where it really adds value, is the range of different nationalities who attend these courses. And they're quite small groups, but you can still find, 4 or 5 different nationalities in a group from very different parts of the world. And I think that experience, you really experience the difference in communication styles, and you can explore that. And I think people get genuine insights into how the concepts of adaptability and flexibility in international business are really important, apart from the language. And people go away with better language than they came with. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I think, as you say, there's real benefits to actually coming and spending time in London, partly because then you are doing this full time. It's a 30-hour business and professional course. You're staying in a homestay with a British family. There is a social program. So every opportunity is just really immersive. But of course, if people can't travel at the moment, you can also do one-to-one by Skype. You can do our virtual groups classes on Zoom, and you will still have interaction with other people from around the world. So there's no reason not to be practicing, not to be learning, and you can still also do your self-study. We have multimedia online courses that go for 6 months. So we have a range of options, lovely content, lots of interaction with interesting people. There's always opportunities, and I'm really pleased so many of you have come back and joined us today. It's lovely to know that people still want to practice and want to engage with us. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both. And we've got a comment from Tanya, who says that you never get a second chance to make the right impression. I guess that's what you mean, Tanya, don't you? that's usually true, but we hope that in our kind of safe and welcoming and friendly environment of our classes, you actually might have that second chance, and you might have many chances until you feel confident in speaking English and doing this effectively. So we hope that today's live stream has really helped you to feel a little bit more confident. And of course, do subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to improve your English, both business English and general English, your English vocabulary. We create a lot of content about related to this. So for example, next week we will have 2 live streams as well, one on business English, another one on English grammar, which is great, on Tuesday and Thursday. And if you've got any questions about our courses, don't hesitate to find out more on our website, londonschool.com, or contact us directly either by phone or over email at clients@londonschool.com, which is shown here. So before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you again for joining us. And as usual, Joe and John, your final kind of tips, or is there anything that you would like to say to our viewers just before we wrap up?
Listen to comedy, practice as much as you can, and read about Britain, the British. Interesting subject.
Yeah. Practice. I always say the same thing. People who've been here before know, practice, but enjoy it as well. Find things that you find interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for this great advice and for all of the interaction from our viewers. And we're looking forward to seeing you, in our live streams next week, and also in our courses, both online, in virtual classes, and face-to-face here in London. Wherever you are, we hope that you're keeping safe, well, and you keep learning English. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.